All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Budget Balancing Committee meeting of Monday, October 7th, 2024. I'd like to welcome everyone to the meeting. Because we now have a new superintendent and a new assistant superintendent, maybe let's take an opportunity to do brief introductions around the table, explain everybody's role here. So, maybe I'll start. All right. My name is Maya Bodenhofer. I am the chair of the Finance Commission. I am also the chair of the Budget Balancing Committee at the moment. We do, because this is a joint committee with the Board of Selectmen, the School Committee, and the Finance Commission, we have a rotating schedule where we take turns chairing this. So I was named chair in June. Each committee sends two representatives. The other FinCom representative is Alan Slater, who is unable to attend tonight. Bill, do you want to go next?
Hi, Bill Plasko, member of the Board of Selectmen.
Tony Mazzucco, town manager.
I'm Matt Lanham, a member of the Board of Selectmen as well.
Teresa Stewart on the school committee, and Anne Marie Mazzola is also going to be in a few minutes.
Sean Mannion, Assistant Superintendent for Finance and Operations.
And Tim Luff, Superintendent.
John Chantarula, Director of Administrative Services for the town.
Jeff O'Neill, Director of Finance for the town.
So thank you everybody for attending. Our last meeting was back in June, on June 17th. So you do have, you did receive draft minutes from that meeting in your packet. Is there anyone who would like to make a motion to approve those minutes?
So moved.
Thank you, Bill. Seconded by Matt. Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll put it to a vote. All in favor? Aye.
I have to abstain because I wasn't there.
Okay. And no one's opposed. All right, excellent. So you got that. Teresa Stewart abstained. Okay. So thank you for that. At that last meeting, we said that at our next meeting, we would like to take a look at the 2-year forecast for revenues and expenses, and that number that 2-year projection we had seen had shown free cash and like what we were expecting to contribute last year and what was going to come in. Last year we had engaged in that 2-year. So, all right, let me back up. Let's set the stage. Last year, when we came together as a budget balancing committee, we were facing a very significant shortfall between our recurring revenues and what we would like for an operating budget. And so we, as a budget balancing committee, voted to add one-time monies to offset the operating budget in the amount of a little over $5 million. I don't remember the exact number, but we'll go with
5.2, yes.
$5.2 million. And so we were concerned at that time, well, if we put $5.2 million into the budget this year, what kind of fiscal cliff are we setting ourselves up for next year? We know that revenues are not going to solve that problem. We know that operating budget expenses are going to continue to increase. And we were fortunate last year that we had a significant amount of free cash, and we said, all right, and we had money left in the override stabilization fund at that time, so we opted to use some of those resources. But we said at that time, like, let's kind of project out and see, like, what does it look like for the following year? Would we be able to offer some support for the next year? We didn't want to spend down all of our free cash and then say next year we were facing an even bigger fiscal problem. So as such, we said, like, let's take a look at least 2 years. In the past, we had also done 5-year projections to kind of get a sense of what do numbers look like. So since that meeting, Jeff has updated both the 2-year forecasts and some 5-year numbers.
Correct.
Tony sent those out. Would either of you like to speak to those?
Do you want to start or do you want me to?
Go ahead if you want.
I wouldn't say it's early in the process as a starting point. So always early in the process, the numbers are always worse than they look. We backed out for a potential look at next year, any NEA revenue, which was the state was looking at a couple of local option taxes. Those didn't happen. We've plugged in some other expense lines. So you're looking at next year, I think it's $9 million is what the debt is, sorry.
Just under 10, yeah, 9.9.
9.9.
May have exceeded some speed limits getting here. So that's what we're looking at based on, I think, a 6% general government budget increase and a 8% school budget increase, which is sort of what we projected out last year. So the bad news is that's a large deficit to cover. The good news is we are more or less where we thought we would be last year. That dovetails into the conversation over the use of free cash, which we can jump into if you want, or do you want me to pause there just based on the numbers?
Let's pause to on that discussion on free cash. Are there questions about these numbers that were sent out?
Yeah, the 6, the 8, the 4, that's what it was last year, you just carried the same percentage
I'm sorry, what,
on the department, school, general government.
last year we had sort of programmed in, I think the general government budget was 4.25, the schools, I forget what the number was, but we talked at the time, what are we looking at? Possibly a 6 or an 8% increase. So we don't know what those numbers are.
I was
That's
going to
just,
say where those numbers come from, okay.
So, I shared with you guys a spreadsheet over the weekend, and I don't have copies of it here, but just, it's all the same numbers that were given, but just answering kind of a slightly different question, not trying to make any assumptions about how much will operating budgets grow. But if we did not put in any one-time monies, what would be available, right? And what happens is that there is growth in revenue over last year, but it about covers the $5.2 million that we put in last year. So it just brings us back to like almost the exact same revenue we were at before. However, that doesn't even mean our budgets could be exactly the same as they were last year, because our shared expenses are going up a bit as well. Particularly we have estimates in here for retirement and pension going up by 7%, health insurance going up by 8%. Some of these numbers obviously may be too conservative of an estimate, but I think the general idea is there that those shared expenses are going to go up a little bit. So our revenues, if we don't contribute anything in one-time funds, our revenues would be roughly flat. Maybe there's some room there. Maybe the state kicks in a little bit more. There's like some places where there's still numbers to play with. But if those revenue numbers stay flat and our shared expenses go up a little bit, all of our budgets, our operating budgets, would have to come down by about 2% over a year to year in order to balance the budget without one-time monies. I am not advocating that we do that. I just wanted that baseline out there as an understanding point.
Mike, can I ask a clarifying question for
Sure.
Jeff or Tony? The 8%, Tony, that you were mentioning for schools,
yep.
does that include the projected cost of like the additional Coakley staff or not?
Does not.
It does
When
not.
we did that, no. So that's kind of just the base, like Tony said, just the base of what was discussed last year. That's kind of where we left it.
Right.
So that's why if you look at the other, there's an additional cost in there.
Yep.
So that 9.9 is without those additional costs. If you include all of those additional costs, which include the Coakley staffing, it goes up to $12.2 million deficit.
Okay. Yeah, I was just, because we talked about the Coakley staffing in a couple different ways last year, so I
Right.
wasn't sure where it
So
was
we
carried
just put
over.
the 8% in there. It's kind of, now we got to figure out, okay,
So
how
the-
do we refine that better?
So the conversion of the grant funded positions are already in our FY25 budget.
That was a question we did have. So if that's in there, we can take that line off. So
Okay.
that's kind of why we left everything on there. There might be some things that can come out or some
Yeah.
things that need to be adjusted.
Okay. Okay. Does the Coakley staff number projections include what facilities that they need, or just the money in the school budget?
That $500,000 number included, if that's the number that we're referring to, was the initial projection of additional positions, and that included 2 custodians. Obviously, that would end up getting shown somewhere else, but we're sort of starting up here about what that needs to be.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just trying to carry over the spring conversation to now, make sure
Right.
everybody knows what we're talking about.
I didn't see it, but maybe you guys did send it. Is there a list somewhere of sort of the assumptions that were made in the 5-year projections we've done that in the past, just kind of say like, oh, for health insurance, we assumed 7% per year, like whatever those numbers are.
We do have that.
Okay. That would be helpful to see at some point. But I also agree with you, Tony, that these numbers are really preliminary. This is not meant today to be a conversation about specific numbers.
Correct. Give or take $1 million or $2, and I know it sounds like we're saying it's not a lot of money, it is, we're probably gonna be in here. Certainly health insurance could be 1%, and then it's an easy budget year. It could be 18%, but based on what we're typically seeing, we're looking towards a deficit of X dollars.
So I think in terms of, there was a question about, like, what has budget balancing done in the past? Historically, before we did an override, which was now 6 years ago,
Yes.
the budget balancing would start meeting in January, would come up with targets for the general government budget and the school budget. At that time, facilities was not its own separate thing, but similar would be handled. And each branch of government would start trying to build their budgets to meet those targets. But then we would have a series of conversations as numbers evolved, as the governor came out with their budget and we got to see that first House 1 number, the first cherry sheet number. And as we started to get projections about health insurance and things like that, numbers would be evolving. It was kind of a difficult way to work, and I think it was often very confusing for members of the public because targets were changing and budgets were changing, and it was hard to understand what was going on. But the idea of the budget balancing committee was that there should be some conversation about how do we allocate money, and our financial policies say that free cash and other one-time money should not be used to offset the operating budget. We all acknowledge that that is not the best operating practice. It gets us into problems like we're just talking about right now, that if we don't throw more free cash in this year, we would actually probably have to be reducing budgets as opposed to just limiting growth. That's a tough place to be. So the other thing that budget balancing typically does is look at revenue estimates and come to some agreement on what those revenue estimates should be. Some of those revenue estimates are very clear. There's a 2.5% growth in real estate. We can get a reasonable estimate of new growth. Local receipts are something that maybe has a little bit more conversation. We had a little bit more conversation around the pandemic when things like meals and hotel taxes took huge hits. Those things thankfully have recovered, and so we need to look at, how are our estimates doing there. But local receipts are not going to completely solve our problem, even if we can tweak those numbers.
Let's see, to your point, most of the revenues, other than the use of reserves, are not going to change dramatically. I mean, state aid maybe comes in better than we've historically thought, but you never know. Just off record, Tim, do you know the October 1 count, if it was roughly up, down, flat?
I don't have that yet.
Takes a while to verify.
Yeah, it'll come soon, but I don't have it yet.
Usually that number going up is helpful.
I have a question.
Sure.
Do you include interest income in any of your revenue assumptions? And
Yeah,
where
local-
does that?
local receipts is
That's
in
part
there.
of local
Correct.
receipts. So money that's like in savings or in.
Correct.
Okay.
Again, you can see if you want to, the local receipts are up a little bit this year, so we did have a preliminary meeting where we took a look at kind of reworking some of those numbers, and that's why that did go up, so.
Yeah.
There's an increase in investment income there, there's a little bit more, I think we kind of took a 90% of a 3-year average on a number of those ones that kind of move a little bit.
Yeah.
So that's where you would embed like the interest from the Coakley project?
Correct.
Under local receipts?
Correct.
And that's itemized somewhere where like the finance commission reviews, or?
I mean, we've seen it here at Budget Balancing Committee, seen the local receipts itemized out, not specifically for like Coakley receipts, but like this much for meals and excise
Right.
tax, this much for excise tax, meals,
Yeah.
hotel,
Yeah.
cemetery plots, all that.
Though to be clear, so interest income is up. Remember that this is the next fiscal year budget. So starting next July, it's interest revenue. So most of the Coakley money will be gone-ish by then. There'll still be some of it. So it's just sort of where our general interest at roughly 4%, or our general interest income would be at 4%. We made a fair amount of money off the Coakley by borrowing ahead of time and doing that, but that money will mostly have been spent come next July.
And so you.
Interest is up though.
You assume 4% on interest, and
I assume yeah.
what's
3.5
roughly
to
the
4%. So.
rate right now is close to that, or?
Well, right now it's like 490, but
Yeah.
interest rates are predicted to go down over the next year,
Yeah.
so will be a conservative estimate on that one.
One other question, is the override stabilization completely spent?
Yes.
Yes.
So that's gone?
I think there's a de minimis amount left
Yeah,
in it.
we left the account open.
Okay.
It's earned a little bit of
15 grand,
interest.
so not-
Yeah,
not
so it's gonna be about 20 grand in there, yeah.
unfortunately.
Okay, all right, yeah, all
Okay.
right, yeah. It was, the plan for that was, the override was voted in 2019. The plan was that money would be put into the override stabilization account in years 1 and 2. Year 3, we figured was be kind of a wash, and then years 4 and 5, we thought we'd be withdrawing money. We actually were able to extend that out to year 6, but now year 7, it's gone.
It's gone.
Pretty, like, as you said, there's enough in there to keep that the account is officially not closed, but it's a very small amount to offset. So I think so I think our outcome, my goal for this meeting was that we could talk a little bit about what is our process going to look for the FY26 budget, get everybody on the same page. To that, in support of that, the schools have provided everyone with a list of their proposed budget calendar for how they will be planning to develop their budget. And on the other side of this sheet, I included the FinCom's budget review calendar. This is the preliminary. FinCom maintains a long-term agenda that we put together for the year, and I pulled out all the things that were budget related and put them in this document. So, I mean, we're all moving toward getting a budget approved on May 12th, 2025, which really means that like a month before that, FinCom needs to be reviewing and approving budget books so that we have time to get everything out. So, you know, our goal certainly is to wrap up the budget process by late March. There's a limit to how much we can get started on revenue estimates until late January when we get the governor's budget, but wanted everybody to get an opportunity to kind of see sort of this structure and maybe start to ask some questions. And then also, as Tony said, start to have a little bit of a conversation about spending free cash.
Yeah, I think we should pick a rough date by which point we say this is sort of what we agree on revenues. This is sort of what we agree on for expenditure increases, at least for the controllable budgets, if you will. And then what amount of free cash we feel comfortable offsetting the budget with. And then it's sort of off to the races, knowing that things will change as we did last year. I think last year actually worked pretty well. Local receipts changed a little bit, or some maybe state aid changed a little bit. That couple $100,000 fibrillation that happens, it happens. We just accept it. We sort of fix it in post, as I like to say. So I think we should talk about roughly that timeline, but I just want to talk about free cash for a minute if we could. It's obviously a policy, as the one who wrote that policy, that it's not good to offset the budget with free cash. This is a large number. However, it's a historically high free cash number, and I always remind everyone it's still taxpayer money one way or another. So in a given year where we don't want to make a bad fiscal decision, but we don't manage the town just to manage to our financial policies, we have to provide services. I don't see that world where we tell the taxpayers, because of our financial policy, we're going to sit on more cash than we've ever generated in our history and not do something with it. We are not going to continue to generate free cash like that. I want to make sure that goes into the minutes. I think Mel's taking the minutes. Town manager stated we will not continue to generate free cash like this. Combination of interest income and record building permits. I think maybe $12 million in building permits last year. So great one-time monies. They are not going to continue. I can already tell you August and September's building permits have dropped back down to normal. I would love to pull a $600 million project out of my pocket. Not on the horizon. So the one-time money is truly one-time. Feel free to throw a pie in my face if we're sitting here next year and the number is $28 million again. But I'd be happy if that was the case. So yes, we shouldn't do it. However, there's more free cash than there normally is. We don't want to dig ourselves into a deeper hole by saying, well, now's the time to open another school or dramatically, open a second fire station or anything like that. But some of that money does need to go back to the taxpayers via maintaining their services, knowing that it won't be there next year. But let's face it, 29 million is like 5 times the previous average free cash number. So
Right.
Last year we started with 14 or 17 million?
12.
12. And we saved four of them,
Correct,
right?
and
So 4
4.2.
carried over, and that's now part of the 29.8
Correct.
that we're talking about.
Yes.
Could you help us understand, I'm hearing different numbers, but where did the free cash come from?
Yeah, so 7 million came from investment earnings.
Okay.
12 million, like Tony said, was building permits, so that was 19 million of the 23-ish that we earned.
Okay.
There's a small, motor vehicle excise was a little bit higher as people are buying cars, but
Okay.
that was it. Outside of that, everything else was kind of in line. But those are the big deltas that caused this.
Okay, and I know it's a small amount compared to the 29.8 we're talking about, but the money, for example, that the schools returned, because we didn't use it, and like the transportation warrant article, that's included in this amount?
That was included, yes.
And then
correct.
the money
Anything we closed
that
out.
was not yet able to be transferred from the schools to the rec center extended day, that's also in this amount?
is that technically going to be in
That's
next
going to
year's
be next year's.
calculation?
Next year's,
That's in next year's?
correct.
Okay. Okay.
But yeah, there's free cash is made up of revenues that exceed our projections
Mhm.
and then spending that is less than the budgeted amount. And so we had a good year for snow and ice.
Yep.
And there were, whenever you do a municipal budget, you can't exceed the budget. And so you're trying to get, you're never going to get to spending 100%. It never works out perfectly, right? And
Yep.
so there's, were some positions that were vacant for periods of time because of staff turnover and things like that.
Okay.
So that's money that
Yeah,
isn't
there's always
spent.
some budget turnbacks. It's rarely significant. In a good year, we have a very mild winter that tends to generate it. But I mean, every office not spending $2,000 at the end of the day just doesn't add up to a whole lot. It's usually from unfilled positions, and then revenues that exceed our projection.
Okay.
But it's also revenues that come in under our projection that eat at your free cash. So it's sort of the net of what's left.
So was it largely the building permits that we were not anticipating?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Basically, FM and the hospital projects hit in the same fiscal year.
But I don't think it's fair to say we were not anticipating them. We were talking about them last year, which is part of why we were comfortable making decisions, right? But one of the things is when the state won't let us make our budget assuming that huge one-time monies are going to
Sure.
come in. They want us to look back and say,
We've
what's
received
the
it.
typical amount you receive and build your budget around that. So the budget was built around typical building permit income, even though we knew a couple of big projects were coming up.
Sure.
And just to talk about how that would sort of work out, let's say the state was having a bad day and they ignored that we did $12 million in building permits last year and they just let us program it in this year, and that number, instead of coming in at 12 million, comes in at 1 million. Well, that 11 million would come out of free cash, and if we run out of free cash, we're operating at a deficit, and you're either draining stabilization or you're cutting a budget mid-year, which is next to impossible to do. So it's not like we can just say, well, we did 23 million last year, let's project 23 million, and even if we got it past the state, if that money doesn't come in, you're in the hole the following year, and that creates an even bigger issue.
The state's not going to let us get there. They asked me 3 or 4 times for an explanation, so I made sure, obviously it was the same explanation every time, but they did notice it, and they did ask each time we went through the
And years ago,
review.
the Commonwealth used to be a little bit more flexible with sort of saying, sure, we think that number's going to be there, but I can tell you Norwood got caught 8 or 9 years ago with doing that with building permit revenue, where we've been averaging 400,000, 500,000. We had a great $1 million permit, and then the next year, local receipts showed $1.5 million. We didn't get that one big permit, drop down, eats out at your free cash, which if you go back to historically what we generate without sort of interest rates spiking and large building permits, if that free cash number is a couple $1 million and we screw it up by $5 million, when we go to settle the tax rate in November, if we're short a couple $1 million, we've got to make that up somewhere. And if we don't have it in levy capacity, you're either calling us sort of a snap town meeting to take it out of the bank, or you're cutting your budget in November by $2 million, which is next to impossible to dramatically cut during the year.
We don't have to dive into this today, but just something for all of us to think about as we individually, as our boards, and here as BBC, communicate with the public. I do think we're going to get a lot of questions about the free cash. And I do think last year at the BBC time, no disrespect, Tony, but you said then it was an unprecedented amount that we were never going to go above. And now we have a couple of months later. And for people who especially really closely followed our school budget and scrutinized, I mean, we had a very large turnout at our budget hearing last year. People heard our administration at that time say there could be cuts in FY26. So although I understand the process, I just want us to think about our communication and the messaging around how a few months ago we were telling people there's probably going to be cuts. And now there's this large free cash. And then I know your point is if we didn't have the free cash, we would be reducing budget by 2%. But I think it gets very confusing to the community.
Well, I think, okay, so I definitely take your point that there's huge questions about free cash, and that is something that Jeff and I have been talking about how do we start to message this at town meeting,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
We have town meeting coming up in 2.5 weeks, and that's gonna be, FinCom always does a presentation.
Sure.
That is the big message, is like, where did all this free cash come from and what does it mean for our
Okay.
budgets? But I still think even though there is quite a bit of free cash, it may be that we are recommending cuts. That I don't think we're going to be recommending let's everybody slash their budgets by 2%. But it's, if we see what happens, that we put in $5.2 million last year, and now we're looking at we think it might take almost $10 million to just keep this propped up. That doesn't.
It's not sustainable.
Is not sustainable, right? And so part of the conversation we have to have is, what is something that's sustainable?
Sure.
In addition to those, the cuts are going to come at some point, and you could argue that, we said it was unprecedented, we had a second unprecedented year. If you pull the 15-year history of free cash, it's in 2 years. So
Yeah.
both of these years are complete anomalies, and that narrative to the public, well, gee, where did this money come from? Right off the bat, $12 million in building permits, above projection.
Right.
That's the hospital, and that's FM Global. That's almost $1 billion worth of construction. I hope I'm wrong and that continues to happen and we won't have this problem.
Yeah.
But I can really tell you, it's really not gonna happen. And then the interest income, again, remember, we were ahead of our time in some ways. We borrowed all the money from the middle school at once. And there were some people at the time who even said we shouldn't. I'd love to say we predicted interest rates were gonna go up and we were gonna make all that money. I can't straight face that was gonna happen. I think the decision was, we're not gonna make any money off it. We might as well get it done and not have to go back for multiple borrowings and wait and see where rates are gonna go. Sticking that money in the bank and earning interest on it has done well for the town. But that project opens in September. The day that it opens, a majority of the money will have been spent, meaning, again, next fiscal year, the money's just not there to do it. You go back 5 or 6 years, I think we made less than 200 grand in interest income.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a short-term spike, it's gonna come back down. Interest rates going down is good for society, means we earn less money, but it's a big number, but again, almost half of it is building permits right off the bat.
Do you think inflation slowing down affects anything significantly to the point where we can feel better about some of these increases we've had?
From the town side, I'm not sure, because you're not seeing these price decreases. Just look at a fire truck alone, 800,000, now it's $1.3 million.
One of the other things with municipal economics, if you will, is we tend to be a little bit later to the game and persist a little bit longer based on our purchasing and our contracts. So, the grocery store
It's not a
prices.
real-time thing.
Yeah, grocery store prices go up, tomorrow, and all of a sudden they're up 10%. Milk is more expensive. We're usually locked into contracts. It takes a while before it starts hitting municipalities, and then it starts to hit us, and then it doesn't necessarily.
So it's really not going to
So-
affect things like health insurance is just going to keep getting more and more expensive, presumably.
Yeah, I don't see that one coming down, again, just the way the trends are going. And again, a lot of municipalities are still using their ARPA money, so we're all chasing the same products to
Right.
use that money. So those things are all more expensive than they should be, really. Yeah, so inflation coming down might help, but not dramatically on those items.
Yep.
And even if you factor in, wage growth with general COLAs being in that 2-3% range, plus whatever else ends up in there, it's still probably overall below the rate of inflation.
Mhm.
It's just because of Prop 2.5, the majority of our revenue is limited to 2.5%. Well, that's great if the rest of the world can be limited to 2.5%.
Right, if you look at these numbers, we're, looking at roughly 3.5% revenue growth.
Yeah.
And so, that's kind of the level of growth that we can sustain, would be sustainable, would be
3.5,
in that
4% on
3.5 to 4% number. Yeah.
And the problem there being so you have a year where it spikes up to 6%. Where does that get made up? Right, so it's like if everything could only ever be 3 to 4, we could probably maintain it. But then the other year we're at 6. So what do? We're taking money out of the bank, or you're reducing something that great, we cut it this year, but 2 years later, boom, it just pops back up. And we have the same discussion in capital all the time of, you know, do we do it now? Do we do it later? Do you want to spend $1 million? Do you want to spend $1.5 million? Well, we don't have the million, so it's a lot more fluid than I think anyone wishes it would be.
Okay, so our item number 3 on our agenda was review of the updated 2-year forecast. So thank you, Jeff and Tony, for putting that together for us. Discussion of the schedule for the budget development and sort of creation of a draft calendar. I think kind of a question of like, when do we as a group want to meet again? I definitely think we want to have a meeting either in late January or early February once the governor's budget is out and we have an idea of what that number's looking like, and maybe we'll have some updated estimates in some other places. But do we feel that there's value in having conversations in advance of that?
I do. However.
I was just gonna say, as a school department, we'll be developing a preliminary budget by then, so we'll have our level service budget, you know, what we need to run on based on what we have now, right? Obviously with increases that happen regularly, as well as an improvement budget too. So we'll have kind of a general two-pronged approach that I'll share with Tony, I think prior, just after the school committee, prior to really becoming public. And then I had in our calendar sometime in January meeting to kind of review that, but once the numbers come in from the governor and go from there. We'll be doing a ton of work on that internally to get that ready, prepared way earlier than normal, I think, just so we can say this is what we need. Maybe it's 8%, maybe it's 3%, maybe it's 5%, I don't know yet, but we'll try to drive that based on what we need more so than what the revenue is at the time, and then kind of go from there.
Yeah. I think we need to think about how do we communicate this message to town meeting?
Yeah.
Not in the fall, in the May town meeting, but kind of starting to have that conversation. And, you know, what we've done in the last few years is we've kind of put together a whole package and said, like, okay, here's the whole thing. We recommend all these recurring revenues plus these one-time monies and, you know, all these budgets, and like just approve the whole thing. But I think that we are acting counter to our financial policies. FinCom is nervous about that, and wants to be transparent about that with town meeting and show the extent to which we are using one-time monies and make sure it's very clear and what are those one-time monies supporting. And I think it's quite likely that town meeting is going to decide to put some one-time monies in rather than do slash massive amounts on all sides. Like I think that that's a good idea, and I would support that as a FinCom member myself. But I think that it's important for us to make it clear what's happening. And so one thing I've been sort of tossing around is, would it make sense to put together a budget, a baseline budget that we could afford with recurring revenues, and then supplemental budget that says, this is how much, if we kick in the free cash, this is what we get for it. This is how we sustain, so that we start to make, so that town meeting can have maybe a more clear discussion about what is those one-time monies are really getting us, what it's really costing us to sustain what we have, and then to set the stage for future conversations when the big pot of money runs out to say, like, look, you know, we've been telling you this was coming, but now we're being a little bit more specific about it.
So I appreciate that. I do want to just note one concern. You know, Teresa mentioned a little bit. You know, I mean, just the conversations last year alone cost me 2 or 3 good staff members because I thought they were going to lose their jobs, right? And so you start saying, here's a budget, you know, based on a non-structural deficit, right? You know, and that we have, and it requires the cutting of, you know, 30 positions, for example. You're going to have people leaving too, even if we don't cut that many positions. So I want to make sure that we support our staff in all departments, not just the schools, in terms of having these conversations, because it can certainly impact the the staff that we have, and and how good they are. So
They do not want to wait till they get cut. They're going to do
That's right.
it before it happens.
that's right, and that happened last year already. So.
Yeah, and that's part of why I brought up the messaging, but then also to your point, Maya, of how we talk about this now does feed into town meeting for those who very closely follow BBC or FinCom or school committee. We definitely have people who very closely follow school committee, and just that transparency amongst all of us in our communication. Where are we on conversations that we've had previously around like the Medicaid reimbursement and Chapter 70 and increases, and then also obviously the override pledge has ended, but there was an FTE cap in there, and then last year it was expressed by some members on BBC that you wanted to see that continue, and then we said, okay, we ran out of time, we're going to pause those conversations for FY25 and we're going to come back for FY26, because I think some of those conversations may also impact the work that we're doing on the school side. And as you can see on the calendar, and Tim alluded to, Tim and Sean are pulling our budget cycle about 6 weeks earlier than our previous administration used to do.
I think that some of those things you mentioned are pretty detailed accounting questions, and maybe best worked out by the, Jeff and Sean and Tim and Tony, and come to us with a recommendation. I don't think that that's really like the purview of this committee. And so I think maybe it makes sense to schedule a meeting to once there's a decision on that, and maybe we can kind of talk about what would be a target for how we'd like to talk about some of those things. I think yes, there was talk about that FTE cap. I think my understanding of what people's concerns with the FTE count was really not about the actual count. It was about the fact that we have a shared budget item for benefits. And historically, including back when I was on the school committee, so I certainly know this is a thing, is that, the school budget looks at what is the salary. And if there's room in the budget, the salary would sometimes get added, but we need to make sure that we're accounting for the fact that there's a cost on the other side and so the FTE cap was put in there originally as a method to try to control that other side. I never loved that system, and if somebody wants to come up with a better system, I personally would be super open to that. But I do think that there needs to be something that is not just if general government side as well, if you've got room in your budget for the salary, then don't worry about the benefits. They're free. No, they're not.
Yeah, well, I mean, both sides are losing on the other end. So I mean, where I counter a little bit, I wouldn't blame the school department for saying, hey, we got money added in, who cares about the benefits? The following year, it's just, well, we have less money available. So it's it's all one pot of money. It's about how we organize it. I think the FTE cap was to, if we want to control our expenditure growth, we have to control our growth in headcount. If Alan were here, and he's not, so we get to pick on him, the first thing Alan always goes to is, well, you have savings from higher downs. I mean, you do, but then you're going to budgeting somebody at the first step, meaning that your salary is going to grow 5 or 6 or 7%. I don't know what the math would be to book everyone at the top step, but again, we take the savings, and it's great, it was a good budget year, and then we're starting at the beginning, so then your real wages are growing 5 or 6%. Just two things. One, town meeting, the budget message I sent to town meeting last year said we're going to need an override in 2 years. I know people don't like to throw the O word out there. Maybe we generate enough free cash that it gets kicked out 3 years, but if you go back in time, and it's hard, especially for newer town meeting members, we did an override. We said we guarantee this will last 5 years, and our goal is to stretch it out as long as possible before we be back here again. I think this coming year is year 7. FY26 will be year 7. Maybe there's enough money to make FY28 work, and then maybe it's FY29 we're having a problem. At which point we've gotten almost double as long as we originally projected. If we really take a look back at our financial planning over the course of a decade, we're doing well overall. There's nobody that can say, well, wait a minute, you expected in year 8 that everything will be happy. No one made that promise, nobody made that discussion. It was always, if you let us raise taxes X, we guarantee 5 years of stability, and it looks like we've gotten to 8 or 9. I would love to get 10 to say we're twice as good, but we know we're moving towards that. We know it's gonna be difficult with everything everyone else is doing. I have no problem being the one that takes the arrows for that and says, we have been talking about this now for 7 years, and it's there, it's out there. So override coming in a couple of years has always been part of the discussion, that our recurring revenues given our generally limited growth as a community, will never match up to our expenses, and they haven't for 40 years. So we always play the plate shuffling game of moving this around and doing this around. We've done it for years, and even though for years we didn't put free cash into the budget, we did other things to make the budget look like it was going to balance. You know, when we used to do water and sewer in there, it was, hey, great, water and sewer had a good year, the budget is balanced. No, you're just sort of robbing that one fund and hoping it's having a good year. Or, you know, the light department would have a surplus and it would accidentally find its way into the budget. So we're being a little bit more open and upfront about saying, well, we're putting $9 million of free cash into the budget. We have always done that year to year, one form or another. Here it's just a little bit more streamlined and we can understand it a little bit more and figure out where that money is coming from. So override coming in a couple of years, no matter what we're looking at, the longer we can kick it out, the better. That doesn't mean we just spend like drunken sailors, but we also still have to provide services to the public. That requires increases.
Yeah, but you invoked Alan, and so I'm gonna also invoke Alan.
He wants no free cash balancing the budget. We get it. He's not here. He doesn't.
No. That's not what I was going to say.
For our purposes, when he's not here.
Is that when Alan reached out to me last night to tell me he would be unable to attend today, he was talking about his concern that, you know, yes, an override is likely coming, but we need to be mindful about what level of override could possibly be considered, right? Mm-hmm. And if you look at historically across the state, the largest override ever was maybe just over $10 million for an operational override, and that was in Brookline. We are not a similar sized community to Brookline, and so...
We're not. However, it's important to look at the increase in the tax levy rather than the dollar amount, and 9.6 is high, but if you're looking at that $8 to $9 million range, as a percentage of the tax levy, that's roughly where we were 6 years ago. And in terms of the actual impact on your taxes, now yes, taxes have gone up. We've seen growth in, we have not seen growth in the commercial base at the level we have in residential, and that's doesn't satisfy a lot of people. But the bottom line is, if we're doing an override in 2 years, your property is probably worth 60% more than it was when we did the last override. That means nothing for the money that comes out of your checking account, but to say that in terms of size and scope, that $8 million range is roughly comparable to where it was in 2019.
But I don't think we ever wanted to get back there, right? Like, that first override was enormous compared to most other communities, and that was because we had for years prided ourselves on having never done an operational override, and we got to the point where we had cut some things back in really uncomfortable ways and in really detrimental. And so it was a major correction, and I think what we had often hoped was that, all right, we're going to do this one major correction, and we're sorry we have to do this. But then after this, it's going to be smaller corrections. And also we need to be mindful of the fact that between then and now, we've also done a middle school override, which I'm super pleased about. I think it's a great, it was absolutely necessary and good for the town in the long run. But we just need to be mindful of how much we might be asking taxpayers for.
Sure. I think if we can keep it in the framework of where we were before, at least this is roughly what our structural deficit is. It's been a hell of a 5 or 6 years since then. We've had the pandemic, we've had the middle school, we've had changing demographics, so it hasn't been just a pretty stable, easy 5 or 6 years, at which point somebody could say, gee, you've grown this much here, you've grown this much here. What's happened since the last override? The frickin' world has changed, unfortunately. Whereas if you were to go back, other than the recession, the 5 or 6 years prior to the override, the landscape and education and public services and the economy didn't really change as much in that 5-year period as the 5 years since the override.
Yeah.
Would it be helpful to start with sort of the end timeline in mind, and can we think of a date that by which budget balancing will have definitively said, this is what we're hereby blessing? Because our meeting, we can try to say,
yes,
we want to meet next month, we want to meet in 6 weeks. We can say, look, come hell or high water, January 15th, I'm making that date up here. That is the date that budget balancing will be concluded. Because as I said last year, at some point we have to go forward with an assumption and build a budget. You'll build a budget ahead of time, but you got to do that work. So do we want to pick that date, January 15th, February 15th, at which point budget balancing will say, you're good to go, and if it gets better, it's less free cash. If it gets worse, it's more free cash, unless it's significant, and we've got to come back and say, well, worse was $4 more million, and now we're in a world of hurt.
We ended it pretty early last February, right?
Yeah,
We
I
didn't
think
meet past
so.
that. And as we're talking calendars, just remember school vacation week, because we often get overlooked in this process. And I think, Tim, Sean, would you agree, we would like BBC to get us whatever the final decision is before school vacation, so that when we come back, if we need to make further changes, we're able to do so pretty
I was going to say, when I'm skiing, I would love to have the information done already, right? Yeah, that sounds, yeah, I think that would be nice.
Okay, so I think, yes, mid-February sounds good.
Remember what?
Mid-February. Because I think, well, or early February, like we want to wait till after the governor's budget comes
Right,
out.
at least that's the one point, and you know, our student count will know by then, but that has a big impact on where sort of money ends up coming in. We'll know the pension number by then. We may not know the health insurance number, but we'll be at least a little bit closer. We'll know our final new growth number from the prior year. I mean, that gets done on June 30th, but it takes some time. So that's probably the best time to say go, and I think we're going to probably do what we did last year, is okay, this is what we feel comfortable with. If the financial position improves, it'll be less offset. If it decreases, it'll be more, but we gotta have that conversation. We're talking about a $60,000 change in aid versus $600,000, which is a big oopsie. Plus, the election will have happened by then, the inauguration will have happened, we'll probably have an idea of where the economy is and everything around then. If February vacation is what week is it?
So it's the week of the 17th, but we were hoping to bring to the school committee on February 12th a review of our proposed budget and have insight if we're going to have to reduce or cut further. So is there a way to have BBC meet before the 12th?
I don't see why not, because again, you're sort of, Budget Balancing can meet the night before town meeting if you wanted the most accurate numbers. If we were gonna be meeting, call it February 4th, what you would see on this sheet with, you know, the 2-year analysis here, we'd probably do the same thing. How much free cash are we using? What's the school budget going up? What's the town budget going up? What's the shared costs, which I'd really like to start calling fixed cost budget, going up? We'll know a little bit more by then, and maybe even a week before we can say, gee, you know, how do we hem and haw to get there based on what the numbers are? I don't think that's unreasonable, as long as we understand that if aid changes or if health insurance comes back far beyond the projection, we've got to just meet again and say, no, we screwed up and this is what it needs to be.
How does Thursday, February 6th look? I'm sorry, Billy, I cut you off.
I was gonna say, instead of talking about when our last meeting might be, maybe we should be talking about when our next meeting should be.
Well, I guess,
And I think we're gonna go in a certain direction, but I think there's gonna have to be a lot of discussion along the way with some voices being heard. Sustainability, we keep talking. 5 years, we've been talking about it for a few years. We haven't done a damn thing towards getting there. Now we're in better financial position than we've been in a long time by stroke of luck, not anything we've done. And if you get a couple years down the road and you think you're gonna take this money and just put it towards budgets that we see in front of us, and then come back in 2 or 3 years and say, let's have an override, because we spent that money without doing a damn thing to prepare for the future, I can tell you, you're going nowhere at town meeting. You can, or not at town meeting, but with the public. You can forget that override. You've got to stop planning where you're going with this today, not simply sitting back and saying, all right, we'll throw 10 million at it, we're done. You do
I'm with you on that,
you're
yeah,
getting
absolutely.
nowhere, you know?
That's part of why I think that, you know, we need to start making it clear to town meeting and giving town meeting the opportunity to really discuss how do they feel about supplementing the budget with.
But that's why there has to be a lot of conversations so people even know what you're talking about and hear the numbers and
Right.
see what it means or doesn't mean.
Yeah.
But
Right.
even when the picture that we draw is dire, to just throw money at it doesn't solve tomorrow, and how bad is it gonna be tomorrow, and then what are you gonna do?
Right.
And, you know, how is it that we got this nest egg that just got thrown in our lap, and then we had to spend it, if we do, on budgets, just to get through? When a lot of other towns we can point to had things come along in their towns where they had little nest eggs, where some money came that was very great to them, fortunate for them, and they were able to do a lot of things. Not their budget, because they managed their budget. And if we can't manage it, and we go back to the public and say we need more, and they knew we blew $20 million, you're not getting you're gonna have a real problem. Probably 4 years down the road, I probably won't be here, somebody else will be, but you're gonna have a hard time, you're not gonna get anything done accomplished. You gotta start now, not 4 years from now. Actually, should have started 3 years ago.
I agree. I just want to make sure budget balancing as a committee focuses on its responsibility to sort of bless something for the following year, so we don't just lose sight of that and continue discussions. At some point, budgets have to be made. So starting with the February 6th, that we at least have an end
Well,
date.
roll
that-
into two things. You wanna get started with the budget, which needs to happen, but you can't get started with the budget until we know what we're doing, what's available. You're gonna be administrators, not just you. Are you gonna be able to use it or no, because as a community, we're doing something else with it.
Right.
No. All right. I agree with Bill, but let's go back to the question of the February 6th. Does that work as, it's a Thursday?
That's our last meeting, if you will, for this budget cycle. That's not our next meeting, just to be.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Like 5 PM again? Is that what you're thinking?
I like 5 p.m.
Yeah, that
That-
actually works. That works great because that gives me some time, depending on what we do, to then make some modification recommendations.
Right?
Okay. Okay, good. Then, as Tony said, that is not our next meeting. That is our goal for the final meeting of this cycle. I think that there have been a few questions raised here. One is, what's the most prudent way to go forward with spending some one-time monies? What kind of guardrails do we want to put around that? I was talking to someone and talking about how this is nearly $30 million. It's a lot of money, but it's like a family getting an extra 2 months of salary. And that's wonderful. It's like reduces stress and hopefully can help you do something good with your finances, but you're not set for life, right? It's not like you can change your lifestyle.
9 million, not 290 million.
Right, exactly. It's not life changing. It's like, so, but this is a great opportunity. We can be mindful about how do we want to spend this, or how do we want to allocate this? What do we want this to do for us? And maybe, and the family analogy, maybe it's, we want to build up our rainy day fund, or maybe it's like, well, we are going to splurge a little bit on one family trip, but it doesn't mean we're buying a private jet and we're going, like, what does this mean? And I think that that's something we as a community need to be talking about. But then there's also this question about some of like the more administrative accounting things and how should we handle this, money this revenue, that special revenue that's coming in, and how should we handle this? And that I don't think I want to get us too down into the weeds on in a setting like this.
Well, we've tried for 3 years to hash it out. We're not getting anywhere in this setting.
But we have 3 brand new players to this.
Well, that's my point. There's different people and the opportunity to say, look at it and bring it back to us.
Right,
Which is
right.
also something we've been doing as a school committee. Hey, Tim and Sean, look at it and bring it back to us. I'm agreeing with you. I'm just saying we've tried. Like, publicly we've tried. We've talked about Chapter 70. We've talked about Medicaid. And
Right. But also, we need to be honest that it's just an allocation. It doesn't change the bottom line.
Not necessarily. So, for example, and I already had a conversation with Tony about this a while back. There's mass health billing that we're not doing that can bring in revenue of $300,000 or $400,000, $500,000 and support specific related service staff in our district. So when we get down to looking at reductions, right, maybe we don't have to make those reductions because we have a revolving account perhaps that can fund those staff members. But those are conversations that need to come up and maybe bring in more revenue too.
Sure.
Not just the administrative cost kind of sharing things.
Right. But whether we bring in Chapter 70 revenue as a shared expense that again gets allocated out, or it becomes its own stream, and then there's
The bucket's the same size.
right. The bucket's the same size. It's a question. It changes the narrative a little bit. It's not that I don't want to have that conversation, but there's no huge salvation in like, oh well, we just changed this formula and everything is resolved. But I would love to have us look at a proposal, I don't have any sense of how long it might take to do such a proposal and when it would be reasonable for us to have that conversation.
Proposal for what specifically?
Medicaid reimbursement.
Well, Tim and I have talked about that. As soon as he has it ready, we can look at it. And I mean, if you can take positions off your budget and dump them into a revolving fund, I think to Maya's point, at the end of the day, it's a $300,000 revenue. It's not going to change anything one way or another. If you can take it off, but you can shave some expenses here, so maybe that 8% becomes 7% because now they're not in the budget or whatever. I think that's all fine. It's a good idea. That $8 million, $9 million offset we're looking at is still going to be $8 or $9 million.
Well, for you, for here, but not as a school committee, because one of the things we are assessing, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the 240 grant. And the 240 grant currently has positions that if we change things up with Medicaid, those things get moved to a Medicaid revolving fund, and then that opens up that 240 grant in a whole new way for spending for the school. So maybe it's not changing specifically what we're looking at here in BDC. It is a game changer for the school committee.
It does make some big differences, and the IDA, the 240 grant, for example, we get hit with an extra 9% on retirement. Right? They double dip kind of a thing. So we've just removed 2 of those positions that don't take benefits, by the way, and we moved them into the operating budget. So and then put positions that didn't require MTRS into the IDA fund. So that's 90,000 right there. So there's different things that we're doing, and just I wanted to say that we're looking very carefully at the town operating health benefits side of things too, because we want to make sure we're not like helping us out but then hitting you. So there's a lot of different things that we can do and play around with. But I think Tony and I can get together and put something together, a recommendation for you guys.
Okay. But I think the question is when.
When.
Oh.
Next month's fun. Next month. Next month.
Next month.
Next month.
Okay, so let's
Let
plan
us
a
get
meeting for
TBD
some
date, 'cause
time
I
in.
have some out of office dates in November, and I'm sure Tim does as well. But so if you want to tie it to the next budget balancing meeting, we can try to make that work.
All right, so today is October 7th. I don't think the first week of November is a great idea. I think town hall might be busy with some other things
That is a little
on
shit
November
going
5th. So, and then we don't want to do Thanksgiving week, but there's like second and third week of November. Is there a day in there that would,
Do you want to do the 18th? Does that work?
Monday the 18th? I could,
Will that end up being middle school building committee?
That is, that's on the calendar,
Because
4:30
the
to
11th is a
5:30.
holiday.
Oh, that's right, the 11th.
I'd also be out on the 18th, so I'd only be able to join.
Okay, enough
remotely.
about the 18th.
Geez, Matt, why don't you suggest another day?
What's the second?
ooh,
Second Monday? Does it have to be Monday?
that's
Yeah.
Veterans Day.
Day.
It's a
The
holiday.
The 12th, I was gonna say the 12th, there'll probably be a selectmen's meeting, but if we're at 5 and we can be done by 6:30,
Take it to the 12th.
And there's school committee on the 13th.
Yeah, I can do the 12th.
You want to do
The
the?
12th is a huge fundraiser that the Coakley's doing, so I have to be there.
I don't think we're gonna make any decisions on the 12th. It would just be.
I don't really like meetings next to meetings. I know we don't.
I'll be in
Just
Seattle.
as soon
I'm gonna
leave the
have to
house
be
hoping we're only gonna be down there an hour or so, but if it happens to need 2 hours, I don't wanna feel I have to stop at an hour and a half because I have another meeting.
Yeah,
What about Thursday the 14th?
I'm available.
That sounds
I
like
can do it.
I can do it. I'd be joining remotely, but
Okay.
Yep.
I would also be remote, but I can.
Okay. So let's aim for. Do you guys like 5 p.m.? Is that what you said?
It works.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So.
Is that it?
14th, yeah.
Okay. Do we want to? Let's just go with that for now. Let's have that be a goal to talk about some.
Oh, actually, I think I may be here for that one. I think I'm sending my colleague to that trip. Sweet.
So some of the accounting items there. And if you guys can send us information by Tuesday the 12th, so that we can all have a chance to review it in advance of our meeting, that would be helpful.
so specifically, everyone wants Tim and I to work on a Medicare revolving fund proposal.
discussion about Chapter 70 allocation kind of thing, just to have a conversation.
Yeah.
We can get everyone to break down local receipts, we have it. It's, again, to my point earlier, it's not, it ain't gonna change all that much.
Tony, would you be able to, since there's a lot of transition around the table and in the staff, do you have a quick way to put together the amount of free cash that came to the schools that was equivalent to the amount of the Chapter 70 increase for the Medicaid reimbursement in the past 3 budget cycles?
Not sure what you're asking for.
So we had asked for, not in FY '24, we had that supplemental budget line,
Mhm.
and then you rolled it into '25, but most of that money in '24 was equivalent to the Medicaid reimbursement or the increase in Chapter 70, but the mechanism in which we got it was through free cash. Could we just make sure everybody understands where and how that money got moved?
I think we can.
So they can
So
send-
you're just looking for an increase in, what the increase in Chapter 70 in Medicaid was? Or,
No,
No, there were special line items at the annual town meeting where we were allocating free cash to the schools with the explanation
Yeah.
that this was equivalent to the revenue that was, roughly equivalent to the revenue that was coming in for Medicaid reimbursements.
or Chapter
You know what
70
that was?
increase.
Yeah, we was a couple $100,000. We can look at it. It came in as a local receipt, but because the schools generated it, we said, well, we'll
Yeah.
throw this. It was just kind of an excuse at the time to come up with some money. But it was, this number is matching this, and this is where it came from.
Well, it was
We
like-
can pull that
No,
up.
it was
like-
like $3 million.
It was a lot of money.
It was because of Chapter 70.
350,000 Medicaid reimbursement.
Yeah.
It was 20,000 homeless reimbursement, and then it was 2.2 of a Chapter 70% increase. That's just off the top of my head. I would like the exact numbers.
We can figure that out.
Yeah.
But again, just so everyone knows, the 2.2 I'd have to look at, but the 20K in student homeless reimbursement, that comes in as a general fund receipt, and it was programmed into the revenues. We just sort of picked it as a number to kind of justify the free cash.
No, we didn't pick it as a number. It was tied very specifically to school committee requests for our budget, and we were justifying it. It wasn't a haphazard picking of a number in any fashion.
Right, what I'm saying is it was
Is that
already
the
booked as a
annual town meeting
revenue.
we're talking about?
Yeah,
It was-
May of
It
20.
was a separate explanation of what the money was for?
Yes, it wasn't this past town meeting. It was the town meeting before.
I'm forgetting.
Yeah.
I don't think we voted on each of them independently. I think it was, but I think when FinCom did our presentation, we talked about
Explain, no, what the
this
budget
is
was made
why,
up of.
right?
Yeah, we did. We talked about it specifically in BBC, but we never presented it to town meeting.
I
that
think it
way,
was in the yellow page language.
Yeah, might have been. Yeah.
Yeah, and Karen Sheridan had tracked it separately, and then I'm not sure, Matt changed some things up, but I could go back and get you if it's helpful
Oh,
from Karen.
Definitely, yeah. And so does this committee decide on the use of free cash, or how does that get developed, a plan gets developed
Well,
at some point?
town meeting decides on the use of free cash,
Does the
right?
recommendation come from us or each of the individual committees?
Any financial article that's going before town meeting, FinCom makes the motion before
Okay.
town meeting. FinCom is making a recommendation. But this committee has been an opportunity to get voices from others, and in general, what happens is the recommendation from BBC is then reported to
Okay.
FinCom, and
That's
FinCom
right.
generally,
Before the spring?
yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
I mean, one idea with a lot of free cash like this would be maybe to build up the stabilizations, because then you can spread it, use that over a number of years more in a more responsible way than just putting it in a one-time budget. You could spread it out over multiple budgets by
That
building
is-
up some of the stabilization funds or creating new ones.
That is on the FinCom agenda for Thursday. And contribution to the general purpose stabilization fund is on the warrant for town meeting in 2.5 weeks.
Okay.
I have in the spring, February. The school committee had agreed with BBC to have 550,000 of our sped reserve go to the FY25 budget. But there was some discussion this spring that in the fall, if it looked like there was a way to not use that money or add money to this, is that something that FinCom, or how can we have that conversation around possibly protecting that 550 in our sped reserve so it doesn't have to be used. And then also.
Honestly, I don't think you have to have a conversation with anybody about that, right? Like,
I thought
that's.
the understanding was that would use to balance the budget, but it's like the last $550,000 that you use.
Yes, but as we talked about before, where it gets a little tricky is the school system. If we don't find out until April or May that we didn't need to use that money, that impacts how we could have spent or what we invested in for our staff and students all year. So I'm just asking, with the $29.3 million of free cash, is there a conversation to be had, and if so, with who, around protecting that $550 in our sped reserve? And then if we do need money, it's from free cash in the spring. And then in addition to that, something else we were talking about as a school budget subcommittee is creating another stabilization fund for general education.
I think if I could, the only problem is we have a deficit, and we're gonna have a deficit next year. So it's hard to use the family example to say, well, great, I've got some money, let's put some money away. Well, how are you paying the mortgage this month? Well, I don't know how I'm paying the mortgage this month, but I got $1,000 in the bank, isn't that great? So it's hard to put money aside when we know we're gonna be using this money to balance the budget for probably 2 years. Not to say that saving isn't a good thing, but we can't save and we can't pay our bills. And we gotta make sure we're paying our bills.
Absolutely, but Mr. Bosco, you said that you believe in sustainability and trying to save, and that's exactly what I'm saying on the school side we're trying to do. We're trying to protect our circuit breaker, we're trying to protect our sped reserve, we're trying to look at things under the authority of the school committee that we can do to save money. And we have a student services review that went back out to bid, and we're gonna get information back, and we wanna make sure that, we're doing our part as well. But I know some of these things require votes by both the Board of Selectmen and the school committee, or has been discussed in the past at BBC. So I'm just asking, where and when should those conversations occur?
So I think with regard to the special ed reserve, right? I think that was kind of a question of the school committee. The budget that came to budget balancing said, like, we need a lot more money, right? And so we said, like, look, I think the general idea of the budget balancing committee and the FinCom was, all right, we know that you have this relief valve of the $550,000 or whatever the number is that's sitting in the sped reserve.
Yep.
If you don't have to use that, everybody's happy, right? Like that, it's not like we expect that we were counting on you using that, right? Like it was like we were looking at projections of like estimates for out of district tuitions and stuff like that, but it's all estimates on shifting stands, and we know that. We're like, okay, we know that there's this relief valve. If to the extent that can be protected and kept for longer, then that's great. I think everyone on the FinCom would be thrilled with that. If you think that you will be needing additional money to support the FY25 fiscal year, and you think you want to come to, typically that would happen at Springtown meeting. It's too late to go on the warrant for October. Then I think that conversation would probably start February-ish.
Okay.
It would basically be, instead of asking for a vote of the selectmen to pull $550 out of our sped reserve, it would be asking for a vote of the town meeting to give us $550 to
Right.
balance the budget out. I mean, like that's the simplified version of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would be when it would happen.
Okay. How much of the current free cash is being voted on or debated at fall town meeting in a couple weeks?
About 9 million.
9 million?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Currently.
Right now,
There's-
yeah, correct.
Right, there's, yeah. But as I said, FinCom's going to be meeting on Thursday.
Okay.
FinCom had been interested in putting additional money in reserves. All right. Do we have anything else on our agenda? Just any action items? I think we agreed that the schools and general government, accounting staff and everything will get together and kind of talk about Medicaid reimbursement, Chapter 70 allocations, and send us some information by Tuesday, November 12th. We will then meet again on Thursday, November 14th at 5 p.m. And we have set a target of February 6th at 5 p.m. for our final BBC meeting of the season. And we anticipate that there will need to be at least 1 or 2 intermediate meetings in between those. Okay. If there's nothing else, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
One quick
Okay.
question. Sorry. One quick question.
I'll hold that.
I don't know if this is appropriate for you to see or not either, but our fiscal policies.
Mm-hmm.
So I have been expressing for a while to the school committee that I feel like we need another review of the town's financial policies, and I think there's only currently 4 of us around this table. That was part of that joint 3-board meeting back in 2017 where we really looked at it, discussed it, made sure everybody was on board. Is that something that should be done again?
So, with regard to financial policies, the Capital Outlay Committee had voted to
Yes.
make an adjustment to the capital outlay policy a year and a half ago. FinCom voted it like the next month or so. I don't know where
We
things.
all finally
we
got
just
it.
did.
It's like-
So have the selectmen voted on it as
Yeah.
well?
No, we haven't voted on it.
I thought you did in August.
What?
I think you guys did in August.
Did you vote on the updated
No, we didn't vote
I
on
don't
it.
think so.
Bob brought it, we talked about it.
I thought Bob said you guys voted on it in August.
And I had asked to have some time to put some comments together to actually change the wording of it. Not necessarily any of the real meaning, but the way it's addressed. And they delayed for that, and that would have been maybe our last meeting, but it got missed not on there, and I didn't get it in.
Well, that's what
And
happened.
I actually have sent a copy to the board members, but we haven't dealt with it, we haven't acted on it to either adopt the original draft or mine or anything else, so we haven't voted to support any change in that policy.
Okay, that was a
But we're dealing with it, it's
miscommunication.
before us.
I had heard alternate, that you guys had already voted. We actually voted on it in our last meeting.
No, we're still working on it.
Okay, so there's that one.
Yeah.
The FinCom also has made it a practice when we do like quarterly reviews to kind of do that with
Okay.
checking with the financial policies. As you know, one of the items in the annual budget book is sort of a checklist
Yes.
with all the major points of the budget policies and which ones are we in compliance with and which ones are we not. In general, we have been in compliance with the vast majority of them. Where we have been out of compliance, and Jeff, you'll help me with this, are use of free cash to offset the budget and OPEB contributions. I think those are kind of the big ones that we've been out of compliance with. But the rest of them we are in compliance with. I don't know that there's been any movement to make drastic changes. Is there something in particular that you wanted to look at with regard to?
More of just making sure we're all on the same page, and just with the turnover of boards and administration, I'm not sure everybody is, and I'm the only one on the school committee who sat through that
Do we
that
want to just do a
process.
presentation of them and just explain them and talk through them? We can talk through a little bit about, we had a great OPEB policy that we'd be adding money to the budget every year for OPEB. It just realistically didn't happen. I mean, you get to the end of the year and it's, do we add the $82,000 to OPEB? And it's like, oh, geez, we just balance the budget. And again, do we add the money to OPEB, which we should do? I think the policy was for every new FTE added, we would automatically, over 5 years, get up to the ARC cost for that employee. But I don't know, there's probably another $1 million that should be in there, and that would come with the cost of services. But we can pull them up and go through the presentation with all boards. We could record it and send it out so folks can watch it on their own, or pick a time and sort of just an informational thing for the boards to ask questions, if you think that would be helpful with newer board members.
I mean, FinCom has been reviewing
You
them.
happen, okay.
Yeah. And I think they were originally generated with like guidance from, or we looked at the DLS website, or we borrowed heavily from some other communities. I don't think, we're not doing anything that's like special Norwood in this. It's kind of pretty standard.
Okay.
Except for that OPEB one.
And we found out how
I still don't
aspirational
understand
that
that
one
one,
is.
Yeah.
Our one aspirational policy.
So does the responsibility of the review just kind of lie with each individual board to make sure we're staying on top of our financial policies?
I mean, I think fundamentally that's the
The FinCom.
role of the FinCom,
Okay.
right? But if you think that there's something in the policies that isn't serving the town well, then certainly it's something that could be discussed. And in that case, this would probably be a good committee to start that conversation because it would go back to the three major boards.
Okay.
But I just don't know that there's.
I don't think we need to change policies for the sake of changing policies.
I'm not necessarily saying change.
No, I know you weren't
Yeah.
necessarily suggesting that, but in that vein, you know, what is there to change, or somebody thinks something's not, you know, we're not following it anyhow, OPEB, but is there a reason it's a bad policy, or do we have to just start meeting
Trying
the
to do it,
policy?
or-
Yeah.
Or is there a reason to change the policy,
Right.
because there's no way we can make it, and it's gonna hurt us with bonding agencies or something if we have a policy we're not following.
Right.
But most of the other policies, like you said, all the towns are pretty much copied from other towns, approved by bond council, it's good policies. Why are we changing them, what are we looking at? If one jumps out at us, yeah, we gotta talk about that.
Right, right. And FinCom's take on this has been, there are times that we are intentionally breaking our policy in such that, like, we don't want to lay off, you know, a bunch of staff members.
Right, so you
And,
use free cash.
and so we're gonna use free cash instead, right? But what we have done is made sure that that's flagged in the town, in the budget book that goes out to all town meeting members, and we usually mention it specifically in the FinCom presentation to town meeting.
Okay, okay.
No.
Alright.
Now-
Now you can motion to adjourn.
Teamwork. You have it.
Okay, second. Motion made by Bill, seconded by Teresa. All in favor?
Aye.
It's unanimous. We are adjourned. Thank you very much.